pathogenic, less dangerous.
Yeah. It's more.
Every single day, when you look at the actual statistics in Britain, we're talking about 300 to 400 deaths for quite a long period of time. It's not gone peak up like that, but it's got a long period of time, 200, 300, 200, 300, 200, 300. Now, of course, you can argue, as we argued from the beginning, or nearly the beginning in my case, that in any case there are false figures. And let me give you false figures now, if you want the false figures and true figures. So this week, the World Health Organization published a study. This study argued, and it was broadcast in many news outlets in the last week, that rather than 5 million odd deaths from coronavirus, they now argue there were up to 15 or 16 million deaths. They said excess deaths during the pandemic. Now I put it to you, and I'll justify that in a few minutes, I put it to you that they are not claiming that 15 million people died of coronavirus or even with coronavirus. They are arguing instead that when the pandemic measures were imposed, there were 5 million people who could be attributed to having died from or with a positive test, and there were 10 million people, or up to 10 million, who died as a result of the measures taken in the name of fighting the virus. So in other words, 2 times, even on their data, their arguments, their information, their propaganda, twice as many people died from the measures taken as died from the disease itself, according to the WHO last week. So what have we been arguing? What was the argument that we were condemned for? Wasn't it here in Hyde Park where we attempted to gather to defend free speech, the right to speak, the right to gather, the right to have a dissenting opinion, that the police attacked us week in, week out, and arrested us? I'm on trial on the 11th of June for coming to Hyde Park on the 27th of December 2020. So in 2022, I'm on trial for a charge that was not brought to me until November last year, but the charge was from an event in December 2020. And that event was, I walked into the park with a few other people who I didn't gather. They came along when I started walking in. And when I walked into the park, there were 2 police vans here. As soon as they saw me, the police jumped out of their van and pressured me to leave the park. I said, on what grounds? I'm coming to Hyde Park to exercise my right to exercise my voice. Now, by the way, we went to the High Court and sought an injunction against the police preventing us from speaking in Hyde Park. The judges, unfortunately, did not decide in our favour, but in the judgment they said, we have not established any laws, and no laws or regulations have been imposed that prohibit free speech in Hyde Park. The issue of prohibition was about the gathering of a crowd. So when they came and stopped me from speaking, as you can see if you wander around Hyde Park, there's no automatism to gathering a crowd. Some people specialise in making speeches that have a certain energy about them that prevent anybody from listening to them. They just can't be listened to for some reason or other. Something about the way they speak. So the idea that someone who speaks at Speaker's Corner automatically gains an audience is false. And so the charge against me on the 11th of June, that I'm supposed to have gathered a crowd in Hyde Park to speak, is false. And then I was prevented from speaking, forced out of the park. And once I was forced out of the park, I made a speech in Marble Arch. And then they said, we got a video of the speech of Heiko Koo speaking in Marble Arch. And apparently that's some crime. Meanwhile, the government was having big parties and so on and so forth, as we all know. So it is complete hypocrisy and lies that we've been spun over the last 2 years about coronavirus. Complete lies and propaganda. Now, we have the same phenomena now. We move from one pack of lies about coronavirus, pandemic, the need for lockdowns, the need for repression, the need for limiting free speech, the need for stopping criticism. We've moved from that great scenario, orchestrated by a team of pandemic experts with Bill Gates, the CDC, Event 201, the WHO, the international pharmaceutical industry, and the alliance between them and governments. That was one aspect to controlling the flow of information and freedom of thought and activity, imposed in a fashion that is little different from a totalitarian state. And yet they scream, and now of course, you see the stories now. Sometimes I look on the news and I shake my head, because only a month and a half ago we were told lockdown might be necessary. In December last year we were told the government's being reckless, we should lock down now, stop people meeting at Christmas. And now when the Chinese lock down in a couple of cities, we're supposed to go, oh my God, the Chinese are locking down, as if that's what they tell you. We're supposed to freak out about China. Look how they're mistreating the Chinese. The Chinese are protesting. They're banging pots and pans. Everyone's screaming and shouting. They're killing cats and dogs. Nobody's allowed to leave their home. What a tyrannical and monstrous regime the Chinese regime is. And yet, only a couple of months ago, in fact, only a month ago, the Austrian government, centre of European democracy, well, you had a choice. If you were prepared to get a vaccination, well, you got free sex at a brothel. If on the other side, yes, even you, madam, and if on the other side, if you didn't want to have a vaccination, you were ordered to stay at home. If you hadn't had a vaccination, they had special mandates. You can leave your home if you're vaccinated with a QR code, just the same as in China, showing that you've been vaccinated, double or treble. If, however, you missed your treble vaccination, you couldn't leave your home. And then they said to you, if you're not vaccinated, we're going to impose a mandate, not only on the healthcare workers, as they tried to do here, not only on the care home workers, as they did here, and they sacked thousands of healthcare workers in Britain, at precisely the time we need them most. And they said in Austria, everybody who does not get vaccinated cannot leave their home. I think the idea was from May the 1st. It would be illegal to leave your home if you hadn't been vaccinated. And so much for the Western democratic cries. Oh my God, look what they're doing in Shanghai, when they were going to do even more draconian measures in Britain, in Europe.
What about all those walls, barriers they put up? Huge walls all around, imprisoning everybody in Shanghai.
Yeah, Shanghai. But don't forget, Shanghai is 26 million people out of 1.4 billion people. I believe it would have been, had there been ever an argument for lockdown, and I did argue in favour of that at the beginning. The fact of the matter is, localised containment measures are far more logical than national containment measures. If you supported lockdown fully, even if you believe it was correct at the time, why did they not do the following? Okay, London locks down, Birmingham doesn't. And then we see what happens. And when we see what happens, we can draw the evidence from what happens and take action based on that. But instead of this, they imposed universal lockdowns in America, Europe, right across Europe, except for Belarus and Sweden. They were the only two countries that did not lock down. In Austria, they imposed a curfew. In France, they imposed a curfew. And if you came out and demonstrated, They attacked you and beat you. I myself was arrested 6 times. Piers Corbyn coming and speaking a little while, 13 times. 10 times. Don't tell us about how draconian they are over there.
Because they were beating the dogs and cats with sticks until they died. It was horrible. Now, I don't know...
They were beating. How many pictures of that did you see for the whole of China?
Well,
I'm not denying that happened.
But I mean, it's
I'm
serious.
not denying that
if you're an
happened.
animal
But
lover,
it is-
if that's your pet, that's a... And you're saying it wasn't draconian.
How many,
you
how
can't
many
be
cats
more
and dogs did they
draconian.
kill?
I don't know.
In what image you saw?
I don't know.
How many animals did we kill in the name of coronavirus?
I heard thousands.
How many animals were killed in Denmark, Sweden, and in Denmark, Holland, and Spain? How many animals were killed in Sweden? Yes, more than in Holland alone, they killed 17 million mink. 17 million.
Mink.
Yes.
Not dogs and cats.
Well, what's the difference? It's a living sentinel animal,
Well, no,
a
it is
furry,
difference.
fluffy beast.
There is a
They were
difference.
killing cows and pigs.
No. There is a difference because mink.
Well, I'm not arguing in favour, I'm pointing out. Because everything like this has to have some comparative analysis. That's what I just argued. I said in Sweden and Belarus, by the way, the WHO study on excess deaths published this week shows that Sweden, in the whole of Europe, apart from Norway and Denmark, was the least affected by excess deaths. And yet it was the only country that was open all along. So in other words, the lockdown measures were a tyrannical exercise by those in power to control society. It was an experiment in how society can be controlled and dominated. That's what it was, nothing else. It served no... Just take my commander-in-chief. Hello, how you doing? Yeah, I'm speaking on my platform. Say hello to the crowd. Hello to the crowd, says Piers Corbyn. Yeah. All right, see you in a bit.
Tell Piers he's wrong about that.
You'll be here in a bit. So yes, I'm not a defender, even though I've been a journalist for the Chinese press for 13 years. 13 years I was working for the Chinese media, state media. But I can tell you this, I'm not in favour of what they're doing. But to be fair, they spent 2 years without lockdown. When we were in and out of lockdown for months on end, they spent 2 years without. So, you know, if you seriously analyse comparatively what's going on, you know, you can't exactly call them the most barbaric and draconian unless you compare it with what we were doing here. The so-called democratic states abolished democracy. The so-called democratic states abolished democracy and established totalitarian control over the population. You were not allowed to express your disagreement without the threat of imprisonment, of fines, or of intimidation or beatings. And I had all of them. I had all of them for standing up at Speaker's Corner. And the police admit it. They admit it that they were doing that in the name, because at Speaker's Corner, it's a terrain where people strongly believe in their right to speak, and the police are forced, because of public health measures, to act. The police had no clue about public health measures. Every time I was arrested and taken in their van, if there would have been a genuine threat to me from coronavirus, I could have caught it in their van. When I get to the police station, you think the cells are aerated? You think the police stations are aerated? They are not. And one of the most interesting factors proving the argument, or better said, strengthening the case that no measures should have been taken against coronavirus at all in relation to the general population. One of the strongest cases is the police and any other sections of the population who worked all the way through. The police, until May 2020, wore no mask. In the first and only serious wave of coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, in my opinion, I think it was only one police officer died, and he was retired and had comorbidities. One police officer. So how can they have all been interacting with everyone, dealing with all the anti-lockdown protesters, raiding private parties, and yet they did not come down sick? By the way, one of the reasons why I believe China will come out of lockdown, or at least I hope so, if they got the power of the knowledge and the ability to implement the consequence of that knowledge, is that in 2020, when they locked down, 5 million people left Wuhan in the 10 days before the lockdown. Yet the disease did not spread. Why did it not spread? Because the migrant workers who returned to the countryside before the lockdown are young people. But more than that, they're young people who were raised in the countryside. And because they're raised in the countryside, they had contact with animals from childhood. They had contact with pathogens that are considered dangerous. And that contact provides them with immunity. Look at the stories in the news today. A revival of measles, a revival of, what was it called? What was the other disease they had recently? Sorry? Yeah, no, not the monkey flu one. There's another one. Hepatitis, I believe it is. No, 100 cases around the world they detected. And they said in the news, I think it was hepatitis, they said in the news, the reason why children are now coming down with this disease is because they have not had the extensive contact with each other that they would have had in normal times that have allowed them to exchange these viruses and pathogens at a level that was not dangerous to them, and so they were stored up and affected them harder because they locked down than if they had not locked down. And that evidence, by the way, is backed up by all the evidence in the history of the circulation of coronaviruses. For example, in Beijing, there was a study of coronavirus that showed by the age of 15, all children in Beijing have had infection with coronavirus. And coronavirus provides you with cross immunity to other coronaviruses. And this is known. 80% in Tübingen, the most advanced study of T-cell immunity. Immunity is based on antibodies, they always talk about that. They don't talk about long-term immunity, which is T-cells. So when you get infected by something, your body creates antibodies, but those antibodies lose a lot of energy. So they decline, they wane, they disappear. And instead of this, a memory is stored in the lymph nodes of the spleen, known as T cells. And T cells are killer cells that attack those cells that are infected and kill them off. And they have to recognize those cells. And what they found was, in Tübingen study, that 80% of people, their blood samples from before 2019 had effective T-cell immunity to SARS-CoV-2 infections. In other words, there was immunity in the population all along. And they denied it. They denied it. But now all the studies of T-cells confirm this. And in fact, I was doing research yesterday, and I found that even in relation to SARS, that was the case. Between 30 to 50%, studies from 2016, between 30 to 50% had immunity to SARS. The first time round, of course, the truth of the matter is, this is a misnomer. I didn't tell you, I'll tell you 1 second. This, of course, is a misnomer, because all that's happened is 2 years of madness has come about because data companies, technology companies, pharmaceutical companies, and genetic engineering companies have all come together into a harmonious relationship whereby what they do is they search the world for pathogens that could affect man. They search the DNA banks for pathogens that could affect man. They search the animal kingdom for pathogens that can affect man. And then they scream and shout, look, we found something new. Look, we found something new, with a test to identify something new that has never been used before. If, however, you took that same test, it's my contention that if you take the SARS test, the SARS-CoV-2 test, and you went back to the blood banks from 1970, you will find SARS-CoV-2 or responses from the blood banks in 1970. In fact, I will argue that you will find them in 1870, 1770, 70 AD, 700 BC, 7000 BC. Because these viruses come originally from insects. They are transmitted to mammals by consumption, like bats that eat insects. The coronavirus family is a bat-derived set of viruses. There are 15 identified SARS coronaviruses hosted by bats. How many of you have been in a cave? How many? Ever been in a cave? Right. So, is there a chance that when you're in a cave, you saw masses of bats, swarms of bats, and then you might have disturbed them, and they flew around, and you know how they identify where they are? It's called echolocation. What is echolocation? Echolocation is the same as me shouting at the top of my voice. They go all the time, emitting from their lungs coronaviruses and SARS viruses. That is how man and animal have always lived, let's face it. When we talk to each other, in a bar, in a restaurant, at home, what do you think happens? You think we don't transmit things to each other? You think we aren't transmitting bacteria and viruses? You can fit 500 million rhinoviruses, a common cold-causing virus, on the head of a pin. More than the population of Europe on the head of a pin. And we're supposed to believe that these viruses can be stopped by the grand effort of man to stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. And they've destroyed the NHS. It was the destruction of the NHS that was carried out in the name of lockdowns. Yes, I'm sorry.
I've looked at the figures around the world for morbidity in terms of
The WHO just published.
yes, rich countries and poor countries. And rich countries have done far, far, far worse than poor countries.
Well, that was the interesting thing.
Despite the massive vaccination programs, poor countries have done much, much better than rich countries.
Yes.
The only explanation is what you say, and also, could it be that the modern way of living is causing things like cytokine storms that's actually killing? So it's not the virus that's killing people, it's the modern way, and the human body itself is attacking itself and killing people, not the virus.
You see, modern medicine emerged at the same time as the, if you like, the worshipping of science. So there began to be this sort of classification methodology. Western modern science is based upon the idea that you can mathematically calculate and predict processes, which of course is a valid method. But if you get too canalized and segregated, you will find that each field becomes isolated from the other and becomes thereby not useful but often dangerous. So for example, in Chinese medicine been around for thousands of years. Some of it works. What is it based on? It's based upon esoteric theory. The esoteric theory is that there's a male characteristic which features in the very essence of humanity, and a female characteristic. And both of these yin and yang interplay with each other. And when one's out of balance, you become sick. That's the idea. And then they look at your tongue, and they look at your face, they examine you, they consider what your state of mind is, what your mental state is, and your general physical state, and then they'll prescribe you treatments for your illnesses. For example, coronaviruses are treated as I think it's a cold, something they call hot or cold, yeah? So one's called cold. And then but there's a whole variety of illnesses that are treated this way. And they found Zhang Bo Li, he's a hero in China, he's a Chinese traditional medicine expert. He found a certain herb, a plant, that you could give to people, and they treated 90% of people in China with that herb, or leaf, and they say whether it works. Well, ultimately it doesn't always matter whether it does work. As we know, we can give people a placebo, and they can be cured. You can have a doctor. Sometimes you'll know from your life experience. You're feeling really ill. You get to the doctor's surgery, and suddenly you see the other people around you are worse than you, and you say, oh, actually, I'm not ill, and you walk out. Or you might go to the doctor, and the doctor has a quick chat with you, and when you're chatting with the doctor, and that's the art of a genuine doctor, is not to consider simply what your biological state is, but what your biological and mental state is, combined together. And to look at those forces and then ask you questions that lead you to say things that indicate to them whether or not something is biological or psychological. And the differences between the things are very, very slim. Often, for example, most of us host cancer cells in our body. They do not necessarily result in any illness. Most of us host, for example, the herpes simplex virus. 90% of humanity has the herpes simplex virus in there. But only when you're weakened, perhaps a family member dies, your love affair ends, something else, you lose your job, the weather's changed, you feel miserable for some reason or other. Suddenly, your body is weakened, and the herpes simplex virus comes into play, and you get little sores around your mouth. That's how it works. That's how it works. Some people, it's not, of course, a universal phenomenon. People die. And people die at certain ages. But the fact of the matter is, the difference between the age of death in 1860, once you made it past infancy, and 1960, is not that great. It's not that great. In fact, a chimpanzee living in the wild, swinging in the trees, always in danger of falling to their death, surrounded by pathogens and insects that could kill it, and other animals that could kill it, the average age of a chimpanzee is 40 years of age. That's 2 million years of historical background before, or 6 million years actually, before we had a common ancestor with the chimpanzee, yet they lived to 40 years of age, on average. Now, therefore, a lot of modern medicine is simply the production of pharmaceuticals to make money, to make commodities to sell. If you get to 50 years of age, when you go to the doctor, first thing they turn around to you and say is, well, have you got any heart disease in the family? You say, yes, my uncle died of a heart attack. Well, I think, let's test your cholesterol level. So they check your cholesterol level. Then they come back to you, oh, cholesterol level 6. 6? You go, 6, is it? And they say, okay, we're going to prescribe you, what they call it, semostatin. Statins, to stop you getting a heart attack. In actual fact, there is no real evidence on an individual level of the benefit of statins. They must supply everyone over 50 with statins to supply the drug companies with money. It's one of the biggest earners. You make money hand over fist if you're selling statins, and the doctors are prescribing it hand over fist. Look at the drugs they were using during coronavirus. They got a new one. It's been shown. Latest study, Dr. John Campbell did a video on the latest study, showed that the Pfizer drug, some people used to call it Pfizer-mectin, because of the similarity of the operational mechanism of ivermectin and the Pfizer drug. I think it's Pandovalix or something like that. Anyway, his latest study shown it doesn't work. Doesn't work at all. Has no benefit whatsoever. And yet, still they're pumping out because it costs hundreds of pounds for every person treated.
Why
And
is
if you want
life expectancy growing so much in the last 50 years?
The life
we now
expectancy-
have 89
life
years in
expectancy
some
has grown
countries.
so significantly until 2008 in Britain, until 2008, funny date, 2008. Why should the life expectancy have started to fall after 2008? Very odd, but it did. Why did it grow? Because of economic boom, welfare, healthcare, education, food, shelter. Our lives improved. That's what led to the rise in healthcare. By the way, there are details. I'm not against all vaccines. I'm not. I know people who are. I accept there are strong arguments that they present. But at the moment, I'm not convinced. I'm not in favour of the Pfizer vaccine. I'm not in favour of any of the coronavirus vaccines. But if I was to take one of them, I would take the Chinese one. For one simple reason, it's a traditional vaccine. It's a known, tried and tested method of using vaccines. And by the way, in Turkey, they used the Sinovac vaccine at the beginning. No increase in deaths. But they were lobbied by the Germans to take the Pfizer vaccine. Turkey started taking the Pfizer vaccine. What happened? Deaths began to rise. Now, I'm not saying one caused the other, I don't know. After all, we're trying to get this on YouTube. How can I not have an opinion about these things? I don't. But it's indicative that there's something to investigate there. Now, the interesting thing about China now is, in Shanghai, the most educated and advanced city in China, the over 60-year-olds, only 38% are vaccinated. They don't want it. Why don't they want it? Because they're old school Chinese, the over 60s. The old school Chinese, one, do not trust the government. Two, trust their own immune system. I used to work at a university. I come out of the university in the morning. I walk to go to my classes. I'd be bleary-eyed in the morning. I walk across the university campus, and all the old retired people are standing there doing Tai Chi, Qigong, leg behind their head. They're doing the splits. They're doing physical exercise. They are healthy and well. They treat their bodies well. The consequence of that is they are less likely to come down sick than if they weren't like that, if they were slouched potatoes, like most people in Britain are. Why you mentioned the point about the advanced industrialized countries being the ones where people died in largest numbers. And this is confirmed by the World Health Organization study published this week on excess deaths. And what did it show? It showed, of course, we know what happened. There are two places. I looked at the study yesterday. There are two locations. This is the interesting thing. Two locations where people died from or with. Where are they? Hospitals, and I don't mean they went to hospital. I mean they went to hospital and caught the infection in the hospital and died because of that. I don't know the exact figure, but recently they were talking about 80% of people who are dying now in hospital from or with coronavirus were infected in the hospital. So, where is the outcry about that? The other place they died were in care homes. There was a recent court case about this in Britain. The government was defeated, the NHS was defeated. Yes, they sent people to their deaths in care homes. Why are people in care homes in the first place at that time? I can draw you a parallel with Sweden. A friend of mine works in care homes, in allocating people to care homes in Sweden. And in Sweden, they had excess deaths in the care homes, but people only live on average for 3 months in care homes. At the very last phase of life, they're sent to a care home in Sweden. In Britain, the average is 2 years in care homes. So when you get sent to a care home, it's because the family network doesn't exist, a social care network doesn't exist, and so Britain and the United States and Canada and France and Spain, they dump the old people into care homes. It's a pathway to death that saves the family, saves the nation money and resources, or better said, costs the family, but saves the nation resources. And that is why take away those two locations, care homes and deaths from hospital-acquired infection, and you have no excess mortality from or with coronavirus in Britain, America, Canada, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. And so what are we dealing with? Organizational power of the elites to reorganize the world in the name of coronavirus. Now they're reorganizing the world in the name of fighting Putin. I looked at the data. It's terrible to see the cities in Ukraine being bombed. But I looked at the data. And the data show, according to the UN last week, about 3,100 civilians from Ukraine have died since the beginning of the war. 3,100. Do you know how many people have died from or with coronavirus in the last 2 weeks in Britain? More than 3,100. So, where's the point? Suddenly we were fighting the enemy in Britain. Then we abandoned the enemy in Britain. Everyone can go and catch whatever they like, which I agree with, by the way. And yet the concentration is now on Ukraine. Well, it's not about deaths then, is it? We don't care about deaths. Certainly we don't care about deaths because we're sending all the advanced weaponry we can, every piece of crap stored by NATO in its arms bunkers is being sent from Germany, France, England, America, Canada to kill people in Ukraine. And don't make any mistake, the Ukrainian army would have been defeated by now had they not had the weapons from NATO. So what does this mean? Well, either Europe and America and NATO are fighting for a genuine struggle for democracy and freedom. But if they're fighting for democracy and freedom, why did they abolish democracy and freedom for 2 years here? Why was that the case? Why was no more free speech allowed? Why were we not allowed to come to Speaker's Corner? Aren't these supposed to be the symbols of democracy? In 1940, they put out posters, "Why we fight." Why we fight, they had someone on a ladder, free speech. But free speech was abolished for 2 years by the same people now declaring a war for free speech, a war against dictatorship. Justin Trudeau, just before they imposed sanctions on Russian oligarchs, they imposed sanctions on Canadian workers. They stole their money from them. They stole their jobs from them. They stole their rights from them. All in the name of fighting coronavirus. But if they're fighting a war, well, why don't they fight a war here against poverty, injustice, hunger? Why don't they fight that here? Instead of this, what we have, of course, is a sham. A complete and absolute sham. Then, when they go to Mariupol, now I ask myself, when I look at Mariupol, they say, oh, there's these people holed up in the steelworks. Now, if I were a family, would you go and hide in the steelworks? Would you? A steelworks where the armed forces of that steel command in that steelworks are known Nazis. They'd self-declared Nazis, the Azov Battalion. I watched the BBC report yesterday. They said Azov Battalion, they showed them inside the Mariupol steelworks, and they got the Nazi symbol on their arm. That's who we're providing with advanced, sophisticated weaponry to keep up the war in Ukraine. So what is the alternative to that? The alternative is very simple. The only weapon they need in Ukraine to fight the Russians is the word of mouth. You know, when the Russians invaded Hungary in 1956, Hungarians published in Russian, they typed in Russian, "A nation that oppresses another can never be free itself," Karl Marx. And they gave it to the soldiers. The soldiers mutinied, right? So, because 80% of Ukrainians speak Russian, all they needed to do is say, come in, and then talk to them. And when they talk to them, the ordinary Russian dislikes Putin as much as they, or dislikes the oligarchs who rule over Russia as much as they dislike, as the Ukrainians, by the way, disliked Zelensky and the gangsters who run Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, don't forget the Pandora Papers last September, they published them, showing that Zelensky himself is involved in large-scale corruption from the guy, a multi-billionaire, who funded and organised the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazi forces who are fighting in Donbass and we are giving the weapons to. Now, so how can they turn around and see? It's all about hypocrisy, you see. The enemy is not Putin. The enemy is not the Ukrainian people. The enemy is here at home. The same people who now declare, we're fighting for freedom. Well, they were in bed with the Russian oligarchs only a month or two ago. Only a month or two ago. Yeah, but the Evening Standard is owned by a Russian oligarch. I believe, what's the other newspaper? The Independent newspaper or the Telegraph? I can't remember, one of them. Owned by a Russian oligarch. They were intimately in bed with each other. They hung out with each other. They went on yachts together. They went on holiday together. The Russian oligarchy had ingratiated themselves with the British elite. Their children were sent to private schools, Eton and Harrow, Oxford and Cambridge. They are part of the elite here. Suddenly they turned on them. Oh, it's the oligarchs from Russia that are to blame. Suddenly they turn on them like there's some enemy. They themselves are in bed with them and are as corrupt as them themselves. So, were they fighting against coronavirus? No, they weren't. Because if you look in Britain, these same people, look at the Partygate story. The story is not that they had parties. The story is that they told everyone else that they shouldn't have a party. Because they knew very well that there was no danger to them from getting coronavirus, or no significant danger worthy of being worried about. And by the way, Bill Gates said so yesterday. I saw the interview. He said, well, we didn't know at the beginning that it was only a little bit more pathogenic than the flu. 2 months ago, in fact even now maybe, if we put this on YouTube and say it's no more dangerous than the flu, you get banned from it. It's one of the forbidden zones of YouTube. Don't say it's the same as the flu. And so here we have it. Those in power lord over us in the name of protecting us. Support military action in the name of protecting us. And the result we can see all around us today. Massive rises in prices. I think butter, last week I said the wrong price. I used to be able to get butter for about £1.10. It's £2.15 now in my local Tesco. Correction from last week where I said £2.75. I checked. £2. It's a doubling in price. And so with many other commodities around the world. And millions of people are facing starvation. As a consequence of the price rises, far more people facing starvation than died from coronavirus, or than will die in the war in Ukraine. And by the way, I repeat, the WHO a couple of days ago published a review of excess deaths around the world and concluded 15 million excess deaths, 5 million attributed to COVID, 10 million attributed to the measures taken in the name of fighting COVID. So twice as many deaths, even according to their false data, caused by the measures taken. And how much do we, and that's with Liori, the mental state, ignoring the destruction of freedom, the destruction of joy, the misery. We were in Mexico a little while ago. Cobra Boca everywhere, right? Everywhere you go, someone's got a mask on. What sort of thing is that? Human beings required to see the face, to see the smile, to see the expression. For 2 years, the youngest children, urgently in need of that, often confronted by people holding them with a mask on. Some people slap the mask on the tiny child, wandering down the street. Utter and total madness. And that's what they've been promoting around the world for 2 years. 2 years of madness. Are there any questions from the audience? No. You? No.
High inflation, because last year the government printed, I think about £550 billion out of thin air. And when they did that, that's contributed to the inflation figures that we have now. Yet the government denies there's anything to do with it.
Yeah, they want to make out, of course, one of the big scams, of course, now, it's always smoke and mirrors. One of the big scams now is to make out that the price rises are caused by Russia, right? And the action in Russia. The fact that they spent 20 trillion US dollars in the advanced industrialized countries on subsidies to private companies throughout the pandemic, and that this money was pumped out of nowhere to transfer funds to these, and they made 20 trillion, these companies, the top 10 companies, 20 trillion is what they made, the same amount that was given away. And of course it was just paper money. So that paper money stokes up inflation. More money chasing the same amount of goods. So that's the reason driving up the prices. Of course, by the way, well, it doesn't matter. The idea that this is caused by the war in Russia, what is caused by the war in Russia is the shortage of food around the world. That will affect Egypt, India, Malaysia, Southeast Asia. They're the countries that will suffer, and much of Africa, from starvation as a consequence of the measures that NATO is taking in the name of defending us. In the name of defending us. Everything's in the name, you see. Nothing's actually real. That's why you see the election last week. What a sham. You know, what an utter sham. Nothing is spoken about the big issues. Everything's bullshit. Hot air and bullshit. Keir Starmer is being built. You remember Jeremy Corbyn? They smeared him and slandered him for years on end until they brought him down. And when they brought him down, they put in Keir Starmer. And then Keir Starmer, never a foot can he put wrong. Every day he's cheered on by the mainstream media. He's doing a great job. He's doing a marvellous job. What a wonderful job. Yes, of course, that's the point. All the worst aspects supported by Keir Starmer. Nothing has he done to defend the people, and we're supposed to cheer him on.
What's his name?
Keir Starmer, good question. What's his name?
Sir.
Oh, sir, that's right. Sorry. I forgot about that. I did forget about that.
The headline of the Sun. Did you see it?
Oh, my quietly. What's that mean?
Are you going to Corma quietly, sir?
Corma?
Are you going to come quietly to the station? It's a gag, you know.
All right, yeah, but I mean, the game is to make out there is a conflict between them. You know, did Angela Rayner expose herself to Boris Johnson? You know, this is the story. And then they go, you know, we got a war going on, and we had the idiotic pandemic fraud, and then they want to tell you that we have to be interested in Amber Heard and Johnny Depp 24/7 on television. 24/7 bullshit. You know, unbelievable.
I looked at the figures for
Yeah, man, all right.
I looked at the figures for